Jake Morrison stared at his reflection in the bathroom mirror of Diplomatic Station Zeta 7 and wondered exactly when his life had become such a spectacular train wreck. The bags under his eyes had bags, his hair looked like he'd been electrocuted by a malfunctioning translator unit, and there was a suspicious stain on his jacket that could have been either coffee or alien bodily fluid. At this point in his career, both were equally likely. "Professor Morrison," he muttered to his reflection, practicing the voice he'd use when people inevitably asked what happened to his promising academic career. "Oh, just translating for a bunch of space lizards who can't agree on whether Tuesday comes before Wednesday." The irony wasn't lost on him. 3 years ago, he'd been Dr. Jake Morrison, respected xenolinguistics professor at Earth's most prestigious university, the author of 12 papers on alien communication patterns, and generally considered a genius in his field. Now he was Jake Morrison, freelance translator for the Galactic Mediation Council, professional middleman between species that couldn't be bothered to learn each other's languages. The pay was decent, sure, but the work was mind-numbing. Most diplomatic missions involved translating the same boring pleasantries over and over again. "We greet you in the name of our glorious empire. We acknowledge your greeting and respond with our own ceremonial words. We agree that space is very large and contains many stars." Riveting stuff. Today's assignment was supposed to be more of the same. The Korath Empire and the Velthan Collective had been arguing over mining rights to some asteroid belt for the past 6 months, and apparently someone higher up had decided it was time for them to sit down and hash it out like civilized beings. Jake's job was simple: translate the negotiations between the honor-obsessed Korath warriors and the bureaucratic slug people known as Velthans. He pulled out his translation tablet and scrolled through his notes. The Korath were your typical warrior culture, all honor and glory and ritual combat, with a language that had 17 different ways to say death before dishonor but only one word for maybe. The Velthans, on the other hand, were the galactic equivalent of insurance adjusters, methodical, careful, and obsessed with proper procedure. Their language had 43 different conjugations for filing paperwork in triplicate. Jake took another swig from his flask, ignoring the fact that it was barely 9 in the morning. Space whiskey didn't follow planetary time zones, and after dealing with interstellar politics for 3 years, he'd earned the right to be functionally alcoholic. The door chimed, and his handler, a perpetually stressed Centaurian named Vix, poked her blue head into the room. "Morrison, they're ready for you in conference room C. Try not to embarrass the entire human species today, okay?" "No promises," Jake called back, straightening his jacket and grabbing his gear. "But I'll do my best to keep the body count to 0. He made his way through the station's sterile corridors, past the usual collection of alien diplomats, traders, and tourists that made these neutral zones feel like the galaxy's most expensive shopping mall. The artificial gravity felt a little off today, giving his steps an unpleasant bouncing quality that made his hangover worse. Conference Room C was one of the station's premium diplomatic suites, complete with atmospheric controls for different species and translation booths that supposedly filtered out any linguistic ambiguities. Jake had never trusted the automatic systems. In his experience, computers were great at translating words but terrible at understanding context, and context was everything in diplomacy. The Korath delegation was already seated on one side of the massive conference table, looking like they'd rather be anywhere else in the galaxy. Their leader, a mountain of muscle and scars named Thok Bloodfist, wore enough ceremonial armor to outfit a small army. The Velthan delegation occupied the other side, led by Ambassador Glorbnik, whose slug-like body glistened with the nervous secretions that his species produced under stress. Jake took his position at the translator's station, activated his equipment, and tried to ignore the way both groups were eyeing each other like they were sizing up opponents rather than negotiating partners. "Gentlemen," he announced, falling back on the standard diplomatic opening, "let's make some peace." The first hour of negotiations went exactly as Jake expected, painfully, mind-numbingly boring. The Velthans presented their opening position with all the excitement of someone reading a tax code, while the Korath responded with barely contained irritation that they had to sit through such bureaucratic nonsense. Jake translated back and forth, watching his soul die a little more with each exchange of diplomatic pleasantries. The Velthans wanted to discuss proper filing procedures for asteroid mining claims, but the Korath wanted to know why they couldn't just fight for the territory like civilized beings. It was like watching a chess match between someone who wanted to follow the rules and someone who wanted to eat the pieces. His flask was getting dangerously light, and Jake was seriously considering whether diplomatic immunity covered drinking on the job when Thok Bloodfist suddenly stood up. The massive Korath warrior began what Jake recognized as a traditional greeting ceremony, the one that involved a lot of ritualistic posturing and the presentation of ceremonial weapons. This was actually interesting. The Korath didn't usually break out the formal stuff unless they were either about to make peace or declare war, and Jake couldn't tell which way this was heading. Thok began speaking in Old Korath, the ancient ceremonial version of their language that Jake had studied but rarely encountered in practice. The warrior's words were measured and formal, accompanied by the traditional gesture of placing his ceremonial blade on the table. Jake felt a moment of panic. Old Korath was tricky, full of archaic terms and ritual meanings that could change completely depending on context, but he'd studied it in graduate school, but that felt like a lifetime ago, and his hangover wasn't exactly helping his concentration. The phrase Thok used was Korth Nithvarthalanmore, accompanied by the blade presentation. Jake's mind raced through the possible translations. Korth meant blade, Neth was an honorific. Var could mean either offer or challenge, Thalan was friendship or combat depending on the context, and more was a concluding particle that could intensify or negate the entire statement. In a normal ceremonial context, with the blade placed flat on the table, it should mean we offer our blade in friendship. A standard diplomatic gesture among the Korath, roughly equivalent to extending a handshake. Jake opened his mouth to translate, and then froze. Something about the way Thok had positioned the blade looked off. Was the hilt pointing toward the Velthans or away from them? The orientation mattered in Old Korath ritual, but Jake couldn't remember which way meant what. The silence stretched uncomfortably. Both delegations were staring at him, waiting for the translation. Ambassador Glorbnik's breathing tubes were making that wheezing sound that indicated impatience, and Thok's scarred face was beginning to show signs of irritation. Jake made his best guess. The Korath delegation issues a formal challenge to your honor and calls for mortal combat, he announced, immediately realizing from the way every alien in the room went dead silent that he'd made a terrible mistake. Thok's eyes widened in what looked like genuine surprise, but then his expression hardened into something that could have cut through the station's hull plating. The other Korath warriors began reaching for their weapons with the smooth efficiency of professionals who were very good at violence. Ambassador Glorbnik's breathing tubes went into overdrive, producing a sound like a broken air conditioning unit. Challenge? Combat? But we're here for peaceful negotiations about mining rights. Wait, Jake said, his blood turning to ice water as he realized the magnitude of his screw-up. I think I may have made a small translation error here. But it was too late. Thok was already responding in basic standard, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. The challenge has been issued and witnessed. By the ancient codes of our people, it cannot be withdrawn. The Velthans have called us to honorable combat, and we accept. No, Jake waved his hands frantically. That's not what happened. I mistranslated. He was offering friendship, not issuing a challenge. The Korath warriors were now standing, their hands resting on the hilts of various weapons that probably violated several interstellar treaties. The Velthans were making distressed gurgling sounds and secreting what Jake assumed was the slug equivalent of panic sweat. The translation has been given and accepted, Thok declared with the finality of someone who took honor codes very seriously. To withdraw now would bring shame upon both our houses. The challenge stands. Ambassador Glorbnik was hyperventilating through his breathing tubes, producing a whistling sound that was probably the most terrifying noise Jake had ever heard a slug make. This is highly irregular. We must follow proper protocols. Where are the forms for formal combat declarations? Have they been filed in triplicate? Jake stared at the chaos unfolding around him and came to a terrible realization. He'd just accidentally declared war between two interstellar civilizations because he couldn't remember which end of a ceremonial knife meant hello, and which end meant let's fight to the death. His career in diplomacy was officially over. What happened next could only be described as the galaxy's most expensive temper tantrum. The Korath delegation began what Jake could only assume was some kind of pre-battle ritual, involving a lot of chest thumping, weapon brandishing, and what sounded like ancient war chants that roughly translated to "we're going to turn you into very small pieces." Meanwhile, the Velthans had activated some kind of emergency protocol that involved secreting a defensive slime barrier around their section of the conference room. Ambassador Glorbnik was frantically speaking into his communicator in rapid-fire Velthan, probably calling for backup fleets or legal counsel. Possibly both. Jake stood in the middle of this brewing shitstorm, watching his simple translation job transform into the opening act of an interstellar war, and wondered if his life insurance policy covered death by diplomatic incident. "Everybody just calm down for a minute," he shouted over the chaos, but his voice was completely drowned out by Thok Bloodfist's war cry, which sounded like someone gargling gravel in a wind tunnel. The station's security team arrived at that moment, took one look at the situation, and immediately called for reinforcements. Jake watched a junior security officer's face go through several interesting color changes as he realized he was dealing with an armed Korath war party and a bunch of panicked Velthans who had turned part of the conference room into what looked like a very expensive slip and slide. "Sir," the security chief, a no-nonsense Rigelian named Commander Voss, addressed Jake with the kind of tone usually reserved for natural disasters. "What exactly is the situation here?" "Well," Jake said, trying to sound like someone who hadn't just broken the galaxy, "I may have accidentally mistranslated a greeting ceremony as a declaration of war." Commander Voss stared at him for a long moment. "You may have what now?" "It was an honest mistake," Jake protested. "Old Korath is a very complex language with lots of subtle ceremonial nuances, and I was working with imperfect contextual information, and possibly I should have had less whiskey for breakfast." The commander's expression suggested that he was seriously considering spacing Jake out the nearest airlock. "So you're telling me that this entire diplomatic crisis is the result of a translation error?" "A very small translation error," Jake clarified. "The difference between 'hello, let's be friends' and 'prepare to die,' you honorless scum, is really just a matter of blade positioning and ceremonial context." By now, the Korath had cleared enough space to begin their traditional pre-combat preparations, which apparently involved a lot of synchronized grunting and the sharpening of already very sharp weapons. Thok Bloodfist had stripped off his ceremonial armor to reveal even more scars than Jake had previously imagined one being could accumulate and still remain functional. The Velthans, not to be outdone, had managed to contact their home fleet and were in the process of explaining to their military commanders why they needed immediate backup for what was supposed to be a routine mining rights negotiation. Jake couldn't understand most of their rapid-fire conversation, but he caught enough words like unexpected combat scenario and possible extinction event to realize that this situation was escalating way beyond his pay grade. "Can't you just explain the mistake to them?" Commander Voss asked with the desperation of someone whose peaceful diplomatic station was about to become a war zone. "I tried," Jake said, watching Thok test the edge of his battle axe with the kind of professional appreciation that suggested he really knew how to use it. "But apparently once a challenge has been issued and witnessed according to Korath honor codes, it can't be withdrawn without bringing shame on both parties. And the Velthans are too busy following their emergency protocols to listen to explanations." "So what you're saying," the commander said slowly, "is that we're about to have a full-scale battle in my conference room because you confused two words?" "More or less," Jake admitted. "Though in my defense, the words are very similar, and the ceremonial context was ambiguous, and I'm pretty sure my translation software needs an update." At that moment, the station's alert system activated, filling the corridors with the kind of ominous red lighting and blaring sirens that meant someone was about to have a very bad day. Through the conference room's viewport, Jake could see the first of the Velthan reinforcement ships dropping out of hyperspace, their weapons systems already charging for combat. The Korath warriors saw the ships too and responded with increased enthusiasm for their war preparations. Thok raised his axe above his head and let out a battle cry that probably violated several noise ordinances and definitely made Jake's hangover much worse. "This is bad," Commander Voss muttered, speaking into his comm unit. Station control, we have a code orange diplomatic incident in conference room C. Request immediate evacuation of non-essential personnel and activation of emergency peacekeeping protocols. Jake looked around the chaos he'd created and came to a terrible realization. This wasn't just a career-ending mistake anymore. This was the kind of screw-up that got you mentioned in history books, assuming anyone survived to write them. He needed to fix this, and he needed to fix it fast, before his translation error became the opening shot of a war that could drag half the galaxy into conflict. The only problem was he had absolutely no idea how. Jake had been hiding in a supply closet for exactly 23 minutes, frantically scrolling through his translation databases while the sounds of impending warfare echoed through the station's corridors. The Korath were still doing their pre-battle rituals, which apparently involved a lot of weapon maintenance and intimidating vocalizations. The Velthans were coordinating with their fleet, which had grown to include 3 destroyers and a command cruiser that looked like it could crack planets. "Think Morrison," he muttered to himself, surrounded by cleaning supplies and spare atmospheric filters. "You got into this mess with your big mouth, now get out of it with your supposedly brilliant linguistic mind." He'd been going through every old Korath reference he could find, looking for some loophole or technicality that might let him undo his catastrophic translation error. The problem was that Korath honor codes were notoriously inflexible. Once a challenge was issued and accepted, the only way to resolve it was through combat. Period. End of discussion. No take-backs. But as Jake dug deeper into the ancient texts, something caught his attention. A footnote in a particularly obscure reference manual mentioned something called the Trial of Worthiness, an archaic provision for dealing with challenges issued by non-Korath entities. He scrolled through the dense academic text, his excitement growing as he read. According to the ancient codes, if a non-Korath being issued a formal challenge, it could only be resolved through this special trial, where the challenger had to prove their worthiness to even participate in Korath combat rituals. But here was the really interesting part. The trial could only be invoked if the challenger's species was listed in the Korath database of worthy opponents. If they weren't in the database, the challenge was considered invalid under ancient law. Jake's hands were shaking as he pulled up the Korath species registry. He scrolled through hundreds of entries. Velthan Collective, check. Rigelian Republic, check. Centaurian Federation, check. Even the Zephyrian Trade Union was listed, and those guys were basically talking mushrooms. But humans? Nowhere to be found. "Holy shit," Jake whispered, then immediately felt bad about swearing in a supply closet, which seemed somehow sacrilegious. We're not in their system. This was actually huge. Humanity was relatively new to the galactic community, having only made first contact about 50 years ago. Most alien databases were still being updated to include human civilization, and apparently the Korath hadn't gotten around to filing the paperwork yet. Jake quickly cross-referenced this discovery with the current situation. If he was reading the ancient laws correctly, his challenge to the Velthans was technically invalid because humans weren't recognized as worthy opponents under traditional Korath codes, which meant Thok Bloodfist and his warriors were currently preparing for a battle that couldn't legally happen. But wait, it got better. If the challenge was invalid, then according to subsection 12 of the Korath legal code, the entity who issued the false challenge had to undergo the trial of worthiness to prove they deserved to be included in future combat considerations. Jake started laughing, a slightly hysterical sound that echoed strangely in the supply closet. He'd just discovered that his translation error had created a legal paradox that the honor-obsessed Korath couldn't ignore. He burst out of the supply closet and ran back toward conference room C, dodging security personnel and panicked diplomatic staff. The corridor outside the conference room had been turned into a makeshift command center, with Commander Voss coordinating evacuation procedures while keeping one eye on the Korath warriors who were now engaged in what looked like a very violent group meditation. "Commander," Jake called out, waving his tablet in the air. "I think I found a way out of this mess." "Unless you've invented a time machine that lets us undo your translation error," Voss replied without looking up from his tactical display. "I'm not interested." "Better than a time machine," Jake said. slightly out of breath. I found a legal loophole. According to ancient Korath law, the challenge I accidentally issued is technically invalid because humans aren't in their database of worthy species. Commander Voss finally looked up, his expression suggesting that Jake had just told him the station was powered by unicorn dreams. Are you seriously telling me that we can solve this crisis because of a filing error? Exactly, Jake grinned. But here's the catch. To resolve the invalid challenge, I have to undergo something called the Trial of Worthiness. Basically, I have to fight Thug Bloodfist in single combat to prove that humans deserve to be considered worthy opponents in future conflicts. The commander stared at him for a long moment. So your solution to accidentally declaring war is to intentionally fight their champion? When you put it like that, it sounds insane, Jake admitted. But if I win, the legal paradox is resolved, humans get added to their database, and everybody can go back to arguing about mining rights like civilized beings. And if you lose? Jake shrugged. Well, then I'll be dead, so it won't be my problem anymore. Commander Voss looked like he was developing a migraine. This is the worst diplomatic solution I've ever heard. Yeah, Jake agreed, but it's also the only one we've got. Jake stood in the improvised combat arena that used to be Conference Room C, holding a broken bottle of space whiskey, and wondering how his life had led to this moment. The furniture had been pushed aside to create a fighting space, and both delegations were seated around the perimeter like spectators at the galaxy's most expensive boxing match. Thug Bloodfist stood across from him, looking like he'd been carved out of granite by someone with anger management issues. The Korath champion had stripped down to basic combat gear and was holding a ceremonial war axe that probably weighed more than Jake's entire body. This is insane, Jake muttered to himself, taking what he suspected might be his last sip of alcohol. I'm about to fight a walking mountain because I can't tell the difference between hello and let's rumble. Ambassador Glorbnik was serving as the official witness, reading from a hastily translated copy of the Korath legal codes in his wheezing voice. According to the ancient laws, the trial of worthiness shall determine whether the challenger species possesses sufficient honor to be considered worthy opponents in future combat. Great, Jake said, gripping his makeshift weapon. No pressure. Thok raised his axe and spoke in Old Korath, his voice carrying the weight of centuries of warrior tradition. Jake's translation software helpfully informed him that the champion was reciting something about honor, glory, and the probability that Jake's entrails would soon be decorating the walls. Any last words, human? Thok asked in basic standard, his scarred face showing what might have been respect for Jake's willingness to participate in such obvious suicide. Yeah, Jake said, squaring his shoulders and trying to look like someone who hadn't spent the morning hiding in a supply closet. This is probably going to hurt. The battle began with Thok charging forward like an armored freight train, his war axe whistling through the air in an arc that would have split Jake in half if he'd been stupid enough to stand still. Fortunately, Jake's survival instincts kicked in, and he threw himself sideways, rolling across the floor in what was probably the least dignified combat maneuver in galactic history. Oh good, Jake gasped, scrambling to his feet. He's exactly as fast as he looks terrifying. Thok spun around with surprising grace for someone the size of a small building and launched another attack. Jake barely managed to dodge, the axe embedding itself in the conference room wall with a sound like thunder. You know, Jake called out, dancing backward as Thok worked to free his weapon. I'm starting to think this whole trial thing might be rigged in favor of the guy with the massive axe. The Korath delegation was watching with the kind of professional interest that suggested they were taking notes for future reference. The Velthans were making distressed gurgling sounds and occasionally shouting helpful suggestions like try not to die and have you considered surrender? Jake spent the next several minutes engaged in what could generously be called combat, but it looked more like an elaborate game of tag where one player was trying to dismember the other. He ducked, weaved, stumbled, and occasionally threw his broken bottle in Thok's general direction while maintaining a running commentary on the absurdity of the situation. This is definitely not what I thought I'd be doing when I got into xenolinguistics, he panted, narrowly avoiding another axe swing. I should have stuck with dead languages. Dead languages don't try to kill you for pronunciation errors. Thok was beginning to look confused, which Jake supposed was understandable. The Korath champion had probably never fought an opponent whose primary strategy seemed to be controlled falling combined with sarcastic observations. "Stand and fight with honor, human," Thok growled, hefting his axe for another attack. "I am fighting with honor," Jake protested, tripping over his own feet and accidentally avoiding a devastating overhead strike. "Human honor just looks different from Korath honor. We prefer the stay-alive through dumb luck approach to combat." That's when fate decided to intervene in the form of Thok's ceremonial cape, which had been billowing dramatically throughout the fight. As the Korath warrior raised his axe for what was probably going to be the finishing blow, he stepped backward onto the trailing edge of his own cape. For a moment, Thok Bloodfist, terror of a dozen star systems and champion of the Korath Empire, windmilled his arms in a desperate attempt to maintain balance. Then physics took over, and all 300 pounds of armored warrior went down in a crash that shook the entire station. The silence that followed was so complete that Jake could hear his own heartbeat. Thok lay motionless on the floor, apparently knocked unconscious by his impact with the deck plating. The broken bottle in Jake's hand suddenly felt very heavy. "Did I just win?" Jake asked the room in general. Ambassador Glordnik consulted his copy of the legal codes, his breathing tubes working overtime. According to Korath law, the trial ends when one combatant can no longer continue. As the human challenger remains standing, he has successfully completed the trial of worthiness. The Korath delegation stared at Jake with expressions that suggested they were trying to process something that didn't fit into any of their existing categories. Their champion had been defeated by a translator with a broken bottle, and the coordination of someone who'd learned to fight by watching action movies. Jake looked down at himself and realized he was covered in blood from various minor cuts and scrapes he'd accumulated during his desperate dodging. Combined with the ceremonial war paint that had somehow transferred from Thok during their brief physical contact, that he probably looked like he'd just fought his way through an entire army. "Well," he said to the stunned alien audience, "that was adequately ridiculous." Jake stood in the middle of what used to be a diplomatic conference room, covered in blood and war paint, holding a broken bottle, and surrounded by the most confused collection of aliens he'd ever seen. Thok Bloodfist was starting to come around, groaning and probably wondering how he'd managed to lose a fight to someone whose primary qualification was knowing how to mispronounce things in 17 different languages. The silence stretched on for what felt like several geological ages before Ambassador Glordnik finally spoke up, his voice carrying the bewildered tone of someone whose entire worldview had just been turned upside down. "So the Velthan diplomat wheezed. According to the ancient laws, the human has proven his species worthy of inclusion in future combat considerations, and the original challenge has been resolved through trial by combat." "Wait," said Commander Voss, who had been watching the proceedings with the expression of someone whose peaceful diplomatic station had just hosted the galaxy's most ridiculous gladiator match. "But does this mean the crisis is over?" Jake looked around the room, taking in the faces of the various aliens who were all staring at him like he'd just performed some kind of miracle, instead of stumbling through the most accidentally successful fight in interstellar history. "You know what?" he said, his voice gaining strength as the adrenaline started to wear off and the absurdity of the situation really sank in. "I think it does mean the crisis is over. But more than that, I think we've all learned something important here today." "What's that?" asked one of the Korath warriors, who seemed genuinely curious about what wisdom this blood-covered human might impart. "We've learned that the entire foundation of interstellar diplomacy is completely insane," Jake declared, warming to his theme. "Here we are, representatives of advanced civilizations that have mastered faster than light travel, artificial intelligence, and energy weapons that can crack planets. And we almost started a war because I confused two words in a language that most people stopped speaking 1,000 years ago." He gestured with his broken bottle toward the Korath delegation. "You guys have an honor code so rigid that you'd rather fight to the death than admit that maybe, just maybe, someone made a mistake. And you," he pointed at the Velthans, "are so obsessed with proper procedure that you'd rather call in a fleet than ask for clarification." Thok Bloodfist had managed to sit up and was listening with the kind of attention usually reserved for religious revelations. The human speaks truth, he rumbled. We were so focused on honor that we forgot wisdom. And we were so concerned with protocol, Ambassador Glordnik added thoughtfully, that we forgot the purpose of communication is understanding, not procedure. Jake nodded, feeling like he was finally getting somewhere. Exactly. We're all so caught up in our own ways of doing things that we forget we're supposed to be working together. I mean, look at this situation. We were negotiating mining rights for an asteroid belt that's big enough for everyone to share. And we almost turned it into a shooting war over a translation error. The various aliens exchanged glances, and Jake could see the dawning realization that maybe, just maybe, they'd all been taking themselves a little too seriously. The human has wisdom beyond his species' years in the galactic community, Thok declared, rising to his feet with obvious respect. Perhaps there is value in approaching our conflicts with less formality. I concur, Ambassador Glordnik said, his breathing tubes producing what Jake had learned was the Velthan equivalent of thoughtful humming. Perhaps some situations call for flexibility rather than rigid adherence to protocol. Over the next hour, Jake watched in amazement as the two delegations actually started talking to each other instead of through formal diplomatic channels. The Korath admitted that they didn't really need the entire asteroid belt, just the parts with the good fighting terrain for their training exercises. The Velthans revealed that they were mainly interested in the mineral-rich asteroids for their industrial projects. It turned out that the irreconcilable differences that had brought them to mediation could have been solved in about 15 minutes if they'd just asked each other what they actually wanted instead of what they were formally demanding. By the time the station's medical team finally convinced Jake to get his various cuts and scrapes treated, both delegations had hammered out a preliminary agreement that gave everyone what they needed and established a framework for future cooperation. Commander Voss found Jake in the medical bay, where a very efficient robot was applying healing gel to his injuries while muttering about humans and their apparent tendency to solve problems through accidental violence. So, the commander said, settling into a chair with the weary expression of someone who'd just lived through his worst nightmare and somehow come out ahead. I just got off a call with the Galactic Mediation Council. They want to know how you managed to turn a potential interstellar war into a successful peace negotiation. I told them I used advanced diplomatic techniques, Jake said, wincing as the medical robot found a particularly deep scratch. Specifically, I employed strategic confusion followed by accidental competence. They're offering you a promotion, Voss continued. Senior diplomatic translator, with a significant pay increase in your own staff. Jake considered this for a moment. Do I get to keep my flask? I think that can be arranged. Then I accept, Jake said. But I want it on record that I have no idea what I'm doing, and anyone who expects me to solve future crises through ritualized combat is going to be very disappointed. As Jake left the medical bay, he caught sight of himself in a mirror and realized he still looked like he'd been through a war. The blood had been cleaned off, but the war paint was apparently some kind of permanent ceremonial dye that would take days to fade completely. He grinned at his reflection. For the first time in years, he actually looked like someone who'd accomplished something important, even if he'd done it in the most ridiculous way possible. His communicator buzzed with an incoming message from the Galactic Mediation Council, probably with details about his new assignment. Jake glanced at it and laughed out loud when he saw the subject line, "Urgent translation services needed for Zephyrian crystalline peace talks." Well, he said to himself, heading back toward his quarters to pack for his next diplomatic adventure, at least this time I know to ask about blade positioning before I start translating ceremonial greetings. Behind him, he could hear the sounds of the Korath and Velthan delegations sharing drinks in the station's bar, apparently having discovered that they actually quite liked each other once they stopped trying to follow their respective cultural scripts. Jake Morrison, accidental hero and professional translator of things that probably shouldn't be translated, walked off into the artificial sunset of the station's day cycle, ready to see what other diplomatic disasters he could accidentally solve through sheer human stubbornness and an alarming willingness to fight alien champions with broken bottles. After all, someone had to keep the galaxy from taking itself too seriously.